I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, I'm delighted to introduce you to an influential author by the name of Kaye Hargreaves, also known as the Purple
The
Aussie.
Purple Aussie.
There she is. She is an esteemed author and activist from Australia with a diverse background in sociology, human rights, and she is a professional dog trainer. I got to get her to help with my dog. He's a mess. Her influential book, Women at Work, first published back in 1982, is now being reprinted. It has stood the test of time. It's a wonderful book. It takes a deep dive into the challenges and progress of women in the workforce, particularly since the influx of women into paid jobs in the 1960s and 70s. And she tracks the evolution of these issues to the present day. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the folks at Sweetspire Literature Management for helping us put her in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support writers like her by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing her wonderful book. Kaye, great to see you here today on Spotlight.
Thanks, Logan. It's great to be here.
This
Very
is
exciting for me to have a book that I wrote 40 years ago um, to be republished and also to be so relevant to today's issues.
Like I said, it has stood the test of time. If it lasts from the 80s to the 2020s, that's for sure. What do you see as the most pressing issues facing women in the workforce today? Is it pay equity? That would be my guess.
Pay, or the gender pay gap, as it's usually called, is obviously very important. You go to work, you expect to be paid appropriately. However, I think with the growth of the women's movement over the last few decades, pay and narrowly defined workplace issues are not the only issues. When the traditional labour movement looked at pay and working conditions, we are now looking more holistically at women's experience at work, including things that would be considered more personal or cultural in the old days. For example, discrimination, sexual harassment, being called names, things which you might think are not as important as pay, but they make a huge difference to the experience in the workplace, including emotional health and well-being.
Exactly. Yeah, the work environment is as important as the compensation, that's for sure, because you spend more waking hours at work in many cases than you do at home. Has remote
That's
work,
right, I mean, I have some background in the 1970s in uh, setting up women's refuges to deal with domestic violence or partner violence against women, but um, in those days that was considered to be a domestic matter. It was certainly not a workplace issue. Nowadays, with more women going into the labour movement and becoming articulate, they're saying, well, women are experiencing both physical, verbal, emotional, and sexual abuse on the job. That should be seen as a labour issue, not just a private personal matter. I think that's the big difference that I see between now and then. But as you say, the gender pay gap is important. We have improved a lot, but we're still not there. If you look at the actual figures, uh, say women at university, if they're getting the same results in an engineering degree, then they're not getting the same job opportunities. As they progress throughout their careers, their pay is less. They're not getting promoted as much as their male colleagues. By the time they're ready to retire, their superannuation would be, depending on the country and location, maybe only two-thirds of the superannuation that their male colleagues are getting. So the gender pay gap is still there, and it gets worse the further women go throughout their career. That is an issue to be addressed.
yeah, and it also women's working conditions vary, I'd imagine, from continent to continent, country to country. Are there some countries that are doing a great job and other countries that are doing a not so great job when it comes to
Oh,
equality
definitely.
for women?
Yes, definitely. The world is a very uneven or unequal place. Um, in my first book, I was looking mainly at conditions in Australia and the English speaking Western world, where
Mm,
the issues were comparable. Um, in the update, I broaden out to um, the rest of the Western world, Europe, for example, but also let's look at globalization. Women worldwide, the vast majority of working women are in the developing countries,
mm,
China, India, Asia, and conditions there are very different. They're at a different stage of development. Wages are lower. Uh, Conditions are poorer. There's not as much social support in terms of a safety net or community services, childcare services. So the situation of women in the developing country is um, is much worse. So just to give you an example, in my first book, I was talking about my own experience of having gone to Southeast Asia. I went to countries like South Korea and the Philippines, and I saw for myself conditions of young girls, 13, 14-year-old girls working in sweatshops in the clothing industry. Now, if you go to South Korea nowadays, it's a modern city full of skyscrapers and high tech industries, and they have developed very rapidly. However, I mean, we still wear clothes. You
mm,
still, go to the supermarket and buy t-shirts. They're being made somewhere. The
mm,
conditions are the same, but instead of being in Australia or South Korea, they're now being made in countries like Bangladesh that are at the beginning of industrializing and developing. So they still have the conditions we're very familiar with.
mm.
Young girls working in very unsafe conditions, um, with very little support. So the real challenge is how can we help um, women in those developing countries to make the progress that has been made in the West and in the newly developed countries. That's a
Yeah.
challenge.
Exactly. Going back to my school years, I always remember as a pivotal event in the women's rights movement in the labor force was the Triangle Shirt Factory fire in New York City.
Yes, that is absolutely right. That happened in New York at the turn of the previous century. New York in those days was a country of immigrants, particularly Jewish immigrants who were working in that low-paid garment industry, and that disastrous fire where I forget maybe 300
Mm,
young women lost their lives was one of the uh, crises, one of the events that led to the new women's movement of the 20th century emerging,
yeah,
and particularly it led to the um, involvement of women in the labour movement.
yeah.
That was a really important event. Now, when I was in South Korea in the early 80s, there was a similar sort of event where young girls lost their lives
Mm,
um, in a fire, um, because it was a poor building. The exits were obstructed by materials, and they couldn't get out.
mm,
Now, recently, just only a few years ago in Bangladesh, a similar thing happened. It wasn't a fire, but a building that was unsafe. The girl that was it was creaking, and the girls went out into the street, and they were ordered to go back inside, and the building collapsed.
yeah.
So, in a way, I'd say, well, same old, same old. And I'm not being cynical there. What I'm saying is, we know very well that in the early stages of industrialization, young girls are employed in labour intensive manufacturing in very poor conditions. And as the society develops, largely thanks to the efforts of these women, we get to higher tech manufacturing, and then we get into service industries and information industries, which we are now having in the Western world.
Yeah.
Workers these days are working in high tech and call centres and being information consultants. But as I said, someone is still making those T-shirts.
Yeah. In
That's
some
not
ways,
being
we've
they're not
kind
being
of
done by
taken our,
robots just yet.
I was going to say, in some ways, we've taken our sweatshops and just exported them because you have
Exactly.
people
Yes.
toiling away to build an iPhone in China
Yes.
for long hours for not much pay, where they're literally killing themselves because it's so stressful. So we've come a long way.
Yes.
We're supposed to be conscious of what's happening in the workforce, particularly with women. Yet big corporations like Apple, let's call them out on it, are
Yep.
allowing sweatshop conditions to persist.
That's absolutely correct. And even a couple of decades ago, we were talking about what was called the moving shop, which is exactly as you describe. We bring about better conditions, laws, and labour organisation, and improved conditions in our countries. The large multinational corporations simply go offshore. They relocate and
Mm.
they reproduce the poor conditions. Um, and as you say in China, okay, look, I love my Apple iPhone, let's be honest.
Mm.
I'm not boycotting it because I can't afford to be locked out of the modern high-tech communication industry. However, it's not just poor conditions, it's the toxic effect of lithium that goes into the manufacturing.
Yeah.
Um, this is something that is of great concern.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so funny because you have Apple on one hand acting like it's this above it all corporate leader, and on the other
Mm,
hand, like we said, producing iPhones in sweatshops and polluting our world with lithium. Let's talk about remote work. I'd
mm.
imagine that is a big gain for women, particularly mothers in the workforce, because they have a little more freedom in their day, yet can still provide their families with an income.
Yeah, look, I think that's an interesting point. And of course, we're still looking at the consequences of COVID. I mean, we had very severe restrictions here in Melbourne in terms of people having to stay home and not travel into the city for gathering together in workplaces. We now have, I guess, what's generally called a hybrid system, where people are going back to work, but they're doing a combination of working from home and maybe going into the office or workplace a couple of days a week. Um, and that in many ways is preferred by workers, both male and female. Um, the men are saying, well, I used to spend an hour each way in peak hour traffic. I leave home at 8 o'clock. I get to the office at 9. And by the time I get there, I'm really stressed, and it's the same coming home. Now I have a coffee and chat with my wife, and I say, well, bye, I've got to start work now, and I just go into my office at home. And that is a major benefit for men under those conditions. There is some benefit for women, but it's mixed.
Yeah.
Um, the evidence is that both in the developing and developed countries, even if men are taking a greater share of domestic work, housework, and childcare, um, they're not doing as much as their wives.
Mm.
So uh, women are still taking the majority of the responsibility for domestic work, shopping, or organising the household, having young children, but also now that in my country we have longer life expectancy, women in of middle age who are working and maybe have still have children at school are also looking after elderly parents.
Yeah.
So what I talk about in the first book is the double burden for women of paid work and work in the home is still here. Again, like the gender pay gap, it's improved, but it's still an issue. So working from home is a mixed blessing for women. Yes, it does give women more flexibility, but what they're doing is having more flexibility at juggling the double working life. Say, okay, I'm doing my work now. Now I'm going to take half an hour off and go and pick up the kids from school, and then I'm going to, give them their little sandwich and orange juice, and then I'm going to get dinner ready, and after dinner I'll supervise them doing their homework, and by about 9:30 when they're in bed, I'll start work again. So I'm working 10, 11, up till 1 o'clock in the morning because I have to take off time during the day to look after children. Now, it may be flexible, but it's still a double working life.
Mhm.
And the evidence is, generally speaking, that if men have spare time, because they've got the extra hours and they're working from home, they spend their extra time doing more leisure time pursuits.
Mhm.
So there's a difference there between how men and women who are, say, married and have families are spending their time or allocating their time. And as I say, um, uh, I have women who say to me, "Oh, isn't this great? The younger generation, the young husbands are so much better than our generation. They're taking more responsibility for home and child rearing," and this is true.
Mhm.
All credit to them, but like the gender pay gap, we have made progress, but the inequalities are still there. We still have a way to go, and in the developing countries, so for example, China and South Korea, even Japan, which is more westernized and developed than some of the other Asian countries, it's a very interesting cultural phenomenon that um, their industries have improved, their income has improved, but the culture in terms of the role of women is still very backward, if I may use that
Mm.
term. As a result, the Japanese and South Korean governments are in a panic because young women are simply not marrying and not having children.
Mm.
They're not even dating when they get to be, teenagers and young adults, because they're saying, look, if I get married, I'm going to lose the benefit of having got an education and having got a job. And all that's going to go out the window, and I'm just going to be stuck at home with kids and no opportunities. I don't want that. Thanks, but no thanks. So they're choosing not to marry. And in Japan, they have a very, very long lifespan, and they have what's called like an inverted pyramid. They have an aging population. They have a large number of people in the elderly age group, but a small number of people at the bottom of the pyramid who are the young people coming up. So the government is thinking, how are we going to support this huge number of elderly people on pensions when we've got a small workforce? And that workforce is saying, well, we want to have our education and jobs. We're not going to get married and have kids because that's a burden that we don't want. So
Mm.
it's the whole societal problem. It goes beyond the individual choices of women. But I find it very interesting that where the culture lags behind and the community services lag behind, women in those countries are saying, sorry, thanks, but no thanks. I choose not to do that.
Yeah, they take the corrective action themselves. Let's talk about the glass ceiling. We heard a lot about this, particularly in the
Yeah,
80s. I think that's when it was termed, or
yeah,
the term was
yes.
coined. Have we shattered it? Is there still a glass ceiling? Are more and more women getting through? It seems like, from my experience, I have children in the workplace and they're in their late 20s and 30s. Seems like there's a lot of women managers out there nowadays, unlike when I was a young employee. So
Mm.
strides have been made, but I imagine more territory needs to be gained.
Well, it's the same principle that we have made progress, but we still have a way to go. The popular perception is that you might go into work and say, well, hey, I just had a committee of management meeting and our CEO is a woman. Isn't that great? I say, yeah, well, it is great. We wouldn't have even had any women in management decades ago, let alone being the CEO. However, if you look at the figures, um, maybe, well, I can't quote exact figures, it varies from country to country, but yes, the glass ceiling still exists. It is still a barrier to women moving into management and higher positions of authority. Some women can do it, but it's not equal on a 50-50 basis with their male colleagues. Um, even the fact that you notice, hey, my CEO is a woman, and you mention it, well,
Means she's part of
you
the
know,
other. She's part of the
yeah, I
minority.
mean,
Yeah.
10 years ago, no one would have gone to work and say, hey, I just had a management meeting and all my management are male. And you just take that for granted. That's normal.
Yeah, exactly.
Having a woman CEO or a member of the management team is becoming the new normal, but as with everything, we're not quite there yet. We tend to notice. It's getting to the point where we don't notice as much.
Mm.
And I had an experience recently where I was looking at some court proceedings in Australia. The judge was female. We have more women moving into positions as judges rather than just working lawyers, and that's good to see. We were even ahead of you in the US in that we had the Chief Justice of our High Court was a woman, and we had the majority of justices women. Now
Mm.
that Chief Justice is now retired and been replaced with a man, but nevertheless, we had over 50% on the High Court being male,
Mm.
and that was very good to see.
Yeah.
And they were there on merit; they weren't just given a free ticket. So, in some areas like law, we have improved. Um, I was watching a court case. The judge was female. There was a male barrister or um, counsel,
Hmm.
and he just said quite normally, without any fuss, "Oh, Chair, may I present my next witness?" He used the word chair. She was the chairman, or what used to be called in the old days the chairman. Then we went through a process of getting all in a tizzy about, oh, what do I say if you have your first female? Do you say Madam Chairman or Ms. Chairperson, or I mean, and there was
Right.
endless discussion, which was very irritating because we didn't have a word for it.
All right.
Now the word is chair.
Right.
You don't have to say Mr. or Mrs. or Ms.
Mm. Exactly. And
or
same in
chairperson or
academia.
chairman or chairwoman. The form of address is simply chair. And the male barrister, without even thinking about it, said, "Oh, chair, may I present my next witness?"
Yeah.
And I thought, hey, that's good.
Mhm.
That's become normal.
Yeah. We're also seeing in medical schools, I think the majority of the graduating classes are female. That might be true in law school too. I think it's true in university and colleges that most of the enrolled students are female. So changes are coming down the pike. If there are more women enrolled in higher education, outnumbering men even, they obviously will be getting eventually some of those higher positions. This is a fascinating topic, and I can understand why you wrote a book about it. It opens up a lot of debate on how much government can do, how much business can do, how much individuals can do. And
Yeah.
it's an important work for sure. I'm going to let you have the last word. Anything you want to tell us before we leave you here today, Kaye?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. Upgrading women at work shows that the issues are still very much alive for women today. And I'm now working on the volume 2, which is looking at the situation now worldwide and the emerging issues in different countries. So I'm very excited to be working on that and taking up the issues worldwide for women at work.
Well, we thank you for your work. It is important work. As the father of a daughter and the husband of a wife, all gainfully employed, it's good to see that they have champions in their corner like UK. The name of the book is Women at Work. It was first published back in 1982, but this is a timeless work. It's been reprinted, it's been updated, and Kaye is working on additional work as well. This is a book you're going to want to have in your household. You're going to want your children to read. It's going to empower them. They're going to see how this system truly is or has been rigged in the past, and what we can do to empower women, because we all have a woman in our life that we love, from our mother to our wives, to our daughters, to our grandmothers, whomever it is, to our sisters. So great work to you, Kaye. Thank you for joining us here today on Spotlight. My pleasure. To the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.